Okay, welcome, Afsan Redwan. Uh, Afsan is a PhD student at the University of Cardiff in the field of Quranic hermeneutics. He's interested in understanding how people understand scripture and then convey their opinions into the broader public. He's also a contributor to Yaqeen Institute, where he is published on environmental ethics. Uh, so, well, soon to be Dr. Afsan. I just like calling people via honorary titles. Thank you for coming on. I'm really honored to have you. I was really impressed by your article on Yaqeen about Islamic environmental ethics, partly because I think you're one of the few people who's actually written about the issue when it's such a pressing issue and there's so few Muslims talking about it. Could you just touch on what got you interested in the environment?
Yeah, Hamza, for giving me the opportunity to speak on this today. I think as we'll speak, important topic. It's something which there's much more needed to be done in terms of being able to bring these conversations to light and have these conversations across communities, especially more so within the Muslim space. The so my real interest in this topic started when I was in high school, and secondary curriculum. There's a topic that around climate change and on in global temperature and aspects. Within that section, our teacher introduced us to a clip from An Inconvenient Truth. So I think from the 2005 documentary that he had done, An Inconvenient Truth in 2004. Having watched that and having seen the alarming rate at which the world was changing around us, and yet there wasn't as much of a pace or intensity to try and address or help these issues, really brought within me this almost kind of uh, like a dissonance, because at the time I remember the Quran and reading hadith material and Islamic literature, wherein the environment is often praised and it's a place for reflection and ponderance, and somewhere to connect yourself to in a more. And yet at the same time, as human beings, we were contributing towards its devastation and destruction. So for me at that time, uh, being quite young and very much interested within these things, it just led me to study it further. I did a few more modules on university around ecology and environmental ethics, and so while I was doing my master's in Islamic studies, and the article for Yaqeen Institute, I remember at the time thinking to myself that there wasn't anything out there that was accessible enough or palatable for an audience to be able to engage with, or to be able to really get a quick summary of what Muslim view towards the environment and how these aspects are very much solidified within our religious foundation. So that's kind of where my journey got to. And I remember it was in between the first and second year of my masters during the summer that I was growing very, very frustrated with the fact that I couldn't really find anything out there. I know there was work being done by charities across the UK, Muslim charities that were engaged with this, but there wasn't really that presence online. So alhamdulillah, they agreed for my project proposal and they accepted it. And alhamdulillah, I think since then it's been developed into a curriculum module for educators, which is quite helpful. There's a video I think on it about animal rights, and there was a webinar we did a few years ago online that was about environmentalism and Islam, which was again hosted by Yaqeen Institute, I think with the Canadian branch, alhamdulillah. So from that article, I'm seeing that there is a much more streaming of thought around the environment, and there is this kind of pickup around it, although it's not where it at this most dire moment. But alhamdulillah, at least it's slightly more engaged before.
Yeah, I think the younger generation are definitely engaging with it a bit more. When I was doing my master's, there was, I think, your article. You probably know Fazlun Khalid. There's that book, Islam and Ecology, a bestowed trust in 2003 by Harvard University. And a few people here and there. There's obviously what's his name, the Persian academic wrote Man in Nature, Sayyid Hussein Nasser. That was him, and that's practically it. And even now in mosques and general discourse, it's not touched on at all.
Yeah, and it's odd because I remember at that time I was also studying my Alamiya program, so traditional Islamic studies in the evenings. And when we'd be reading through the various different uses of the Quran, when it came to ayat, the verses that were mentioning specifically about the remembrance of Allah and about the engagement with uh, the nature and pondering over it, the exegetes of the past would have paragraphs explaining why this is important, why tadabbur is important, ponderance is important, and how and help enrich a person's life. And yet, at the same time, unfortunately, we were having this happening in front of us in terms of the devastation that the environment is going through in our times. So it's definitely something that I don't know if we can help connect that bridge between our holistic understanding of of Islam, of religion, of the environment. It may be able to help connect a whole gen of individuals who feel that isn't that connection there in the first place. So I'm hoping it does contribute towards that.
Yeah. And I think it's not just Muslims who we care about the environment. I think it's a common cause which has united everyone now.
Absolutely.
Atheists, Christians, Jews, Hindus. It's one of those causes which unites all. And we seem to be lagging behind
Yeah.
for some reason. But I think in your article, you mentioned some of the existing theories on environmental ethics. I think you mentioned, was it egocentrism?
Yeah.
And anthropocentrism or egocentrism?
Yeah. So you've got
Among others,
ecocentrism.
yeah. Could
Yeah.
you just
Bias.
touch on some of them?
Yeah. So within the article, I'll go into much more detail and kind of the references are there in regards to the books and the works for those individuals. Um, so to understand the Western approach to environmental ethics, it really want to look at the context. We start off with a book written by Rachel Carson. You may have come across.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was really the impetus. Um, that was really the impetus within the Western world. Huge up interest in environmental ethics, and it kind of really brought to the forefront the devastation that human beings were and are unfortunately committing against the environment across the world. I think specifically with that book, it's specific of the policies that were around during that, and the harmful effects of pesticides and other different aspects that Rachel Carson talks about. So out of that, what you have is a kind of a three-way divide of approach towards understanding this concept. As you've already mentioned, in terms of anthropocentrism, which look human beings as being the center and the environment being kind of related to that, and whether the environment and long term will benefit us for human value and human desire. So again, this looks into ideas around intrinsic value and instrumental value and how the environment plays into that. So whether it has any intrinsic cause of its relationship to human beings, its own. This is where views amongst the various different approaches. So anthropocentrism, as the name kind of suggests, places human beings at that center, that the environment is only special due to its relative importance to us and its ability to provide us with sustenance and other values. Then you've got biocentrism, which places animals and human beings within this bracket of uniqueness and its attachment to value, so that the intrinsic value then relates to that. And then you have centrism, which actually places the entire ecosystem as being something which has intrinsic value within itself. Within each of these subgroups, there are varying views and opposites in regards to how they approach the issue. Some, as we have seen within the UK, especially so, are quite strong in their approach towards it, whereas others will take the approach of forming lobby groups and then trying to convince policies through that way. So I think it's very much it's quite interesting to see the trajectory in terms of how it's changed over time and how you still have this loose association between approach and kind of physical presence. So whether with lobby groups or whether it's physical demonstrations on the ground and it's at grassroots. So dependent on, in my experience anyway, dependent on the kind of introduction that a group has towards whichever strand of thought, whether it's biocentrism, ecocentrism, you then see there are some patterns in terms of how they take that and how they apply that, how that manifests. See, within Muslim circles, I don't think there's really been much. I know there's I think there's an XR group or there's an ER group.
Oh yeah, Extinction Rebellion Muslims. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think they've kind of taken on that mantle at the moment. Obviously, I can't speak for that group. I'm not associated or part of them, so I can't really comment on them. But it's we don't really. I don't think we have a Muslim pressure group for the environment directly.
No.
That exists or is out there lobbying, and it's quite, again, I don't want to really that's a really sad kind of podcast, but quite upsetting that we don't have one yet, even now, and yet we have so much in common in terms of being able to appreciate nature and within our own, so within Muslim religion, there's obviously a metaphysical aspect that's attached towards nature, understanding nature, and how it reflects in the verses of the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In the Quranic verses, it's mentioned many times that Allah is the Lord of the East and the West, and whichever way you turn is Allah, right? And that really speaks to this idea that Allah's signs are everywhere. And if we were to reduce the amount of signs which we are unfortunately committing to at the moment, how does that help in the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And then how the idea that Allah bi dhikrillahi tatma'innul qulub, that very in the remembrance of Allah that the hearts find peace. We come to this whole idea, right, of interconnectedness and how the entire world around us is but it's unfortunately breaking that.
Yeah, it's interesting how different people who have different belief systems and their conception of the environment, because as you were mentioning, there's all these different groups among non-Muslim academics like anthropocentrism, egocentrism, and feminist ecology and all that kind of stuff, Marxist ecology, right? Having God really grounds your worldview. And, I just want to see what worldview comes from having God, because when I was studying, one of the questions I was asking my colleagues was, who are all basically atheists, and which means they're materialists for a lot of them, is if we're all just atoms, why is it wrong for me to chop down a tree? Why is it wrong for the atoms, the molecules, to change form from carbon locked in trees and becoming carbon dioxide? Why is it wrong for hydrocarbons to be burnt and become carbon dioxide molecules? This is I think material, because I think, as you mentioned, from a materialist perspective, the value we can judge from other things is only the value we can acquire it from in relation to us. So the value of a tree is only how useful it is to us from our perspective. But with God in the picture, you have the humility to understand that we can, where we don't have all the information, and God establishes what has intrinsic value and what doesn't, and what's sacred, what's not. And having something as sacred is actually quite important. As we're coming to terms now with the environment, we're actually realizing you can't just exploit nature like we've been doing for the past 2 centuries. We have to have something sacred, even if the civilization doesn't even believe in God. It kind of wants the effects of the belief of God, because they just make so much sense to have.
Yeah, I mean, it's I remember I think to I think it was a YouTube video, it was an audio, and the speaker, I think she was a PhD, she was a doctor. she was mentioning how it's quite interesting when we look at nature, when human beings, when they sit and they observe nature, there's a comfort or contentment that they get from observing it, and yet obviously nature doesn't get that same contentment from seeing us.
No.
So it's an interesting dynamic that we have in our relationship, and um, how so even within, for example, urban environments, right? There's a huge I don't want to say demand, but there is a need to have around us. Hence why you see projects being of roof gardens and green spaces within modern companies and organizations, that there is this need within us to surround ourselves with that which reminds us something greater out there. And I think definitely with God in the picture, it ground and provide that intrinsic value that we have to nature. And not only that, I mean, Allah in the Quran mentions many times and uses nature as a metaphor, as an example. Um, and it's again, when we think back to the revelation of the Quran and how it was revealed at the time, to essentially Arabs in the middle of the desert in Arabia,
Mhm.
and God is giving the example of trees, right, which is a luxury at that time, and it's giving an example of how bears good fruit, and whereas that which with bad roots doesn't uh, provide as much benefit. These examples are there for us to very much use as a reflection on ourselves and with the world. And if it could be used for those individuals at that time, and help them and make them um, have that humility and humbleness to walk the earth, then why is it not so for us today? It's an interesting question that, again, it needs exploration and it needs unpacking. So
And what is the conception of nature that emerges from the Quran? If one reads God's book, how do we start viewing nature after reading that?
So I think, as I mentioned before, from my understanding and from my own reading of the Quranic text, it's it's one that uses nature in a multiplicity. It's one that really tries to engage the reader into being able to conceptualize not only God's mercy on earth, but also um, the place of human beings. So, for example, the Quran mentions in Surah Al-Yasin that as an example, we give them winter, and another example, we give them summer, and from that which you bear the fruits. And really, God is trying to showcase to us that every year, in different parts of the world, every year, the earth is caused to die, right? And then it's caused to, the resurrection is true. And if God is able to make that happen on a yearly basis, how do we not think that the same will happen to us?
Mhm.
So, used as a reflective tool of the Quranic text in beings to center themselves, the fact that um, that Allah's signs are here on earth in front of us. And so many, not so many times, but you may hear often when an individual asks you, right, where's the proof of God? Where's the proof of God here on earth? And if we were to look within nature, um, it does point to a much higher power than ourselves. And just to accept that, I think, is a good starting point for us to try and ground ourselves in who we truly are. I think, as I mentioned before, once we lose this interconnectedness between us, nature, the earth, and worship, it becomes very difficult to um, within the world, and it's yeah, it's something which is seen as a theme within the Quran, whether it's used as a tool in terms of being able to um, showcase a message, as I mentioned before, about a good tree bearing good fruits, because it's, again, it's evidence in front of us, something which is good that you can see that's happening. use it in a metaphysical fashion to try and get us to understand something which is much higher.
So the Quran, it seems, it's much more focused on um, using nature as a metaphor or as a tool to get humans to think about the world, and then consequently submit to God, to realize that there is a purpose, there's meaning, and to obey God's law, just as everything else in nature obeys God's law. You know, the sun, the earth orbits the sun, and how, you know, birds go out in the morning, comes back in the evening, and the cycle of day and night, the regularity is like God saying, "This is my domain, and look, I'm in control of everything. So sort out your domain."
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And then that really transcends within the verse which mentions that, that Allah has placed Khalifatul Ard, that He's placed, on earth. And it makes reference to human beings that you're here to look after, to sustain, and to continue to preserve the earth as we have come upon it. So, as custodians of the earth, there's that responsibility within us. And some exegetes do mention that responsibility is linked to this idea of the fitrah, of that innate disposition that we have when we are here, that there's an inclination towards nature. And while that may not be true, obviously, for everybody, um, we can definitely see that, as well, in the past anyway, as young children, playing out all day and being out in the sun and playing in the local, to be surrounded by greenery. It's something which we can showcase as being natural, as something within us which we're trying to reach and to be with.
For most of human history, we have people haven't lived like us, right? They've been outdoors most of the time, and also agriculture. Like you'd say, 80%, 90% of the population would have participated in agriculture to some extent, um, whether that's, you know, shepherding cattle or planting crops, wilding different areas of land, etc. Engaging in the whole process of, you know, shearing wool, all that kind of stuff, milking cows. Um, so I think that the analogies in the Quran might hit harder with people who are in the situation embedded. I think maybe nowadays, because we're not in that situation anymore, especially of those living in urban settings, that connection's been severed to some extent. Like we don't understand the cultivation of the earth analogy as much as people in the past. Um, do you think that's had an impact on our approach to the environment, especially as Muslims today? The fact that we don't talk about it as much. Had we had a stronger connection to the environment by cultivating land or raising animals, then these metaphors would hit us a lot harder, and would take care of. It'd be a lot more important to us to abide by these ethics.
Yeah, I mean, I think something which Reza Aslan writes about in his book, God, a Human Religion.
Mhm.
Um, so it's fascinating to see how human beings, obviously starting off as kind of hunter-gatherer society, made that transition and that leap towards agriculture and suddenly settling down and having homes. And there's a loose connection there to the idea of humans settling down and revelation. The idea that the prophets that we have within
I think
Muslim scripture.
in one of I think the previous scriptures, I think the Bible, I think it's mentioned one of the messengers was taught about I think domestication of animals. Yeah.
About domestic, right? So this idea that um, agriculture was a formative aspect in history is in historiography and within is something which we have viable evidence for. But where that came from, what suddenly led to this urge within humans to settle down and to, uh, plow the land and to reap rewards from it and to sustain themselves from the land. There isn't a solid answer to that. And we have this within the Quranic scripture. So, for example, the story of Adam alayhi salam and how he was taught, the names, and how he then spoke to every angel and then was able to name. God taught him. Some mufassirin again take that this understanding of names, the the ability to understand and to identify. It was actually the ability to also apply in addition to that. So it wasn't only being able to know, okay, this is a book. So also being able to know the inner workings of how it's put together, what the production is, and things like that. So definitely there's this idea within Islam and within Islamic faiths that participating in cultivation and agriculture is a prophetic trait. It's something there. And I think that that transformation uh, definitely speaks volumes to how we should be connected to the land around us. And unfortunately, due to this kind of urbanization that excludes green spaces or want to really connect to that, really introduces us to kind of a right, where things are all machine and you know how we navigate a world where things are all metal and it's not really something that uh, brings us that same connection or that same reflection as you know garden, for example, right?
Yeah. The Quran, it's quite a light book in the sense that it's not very long. It hasn't got many laws in it, and it also says it's not coming as a new scripture; it's a confirmation of previous scripture. So the environmental ethics in the Quran, they're not that heavy because it's more focused on the message and getting people to submit. That's the more important verse, isn't it? Getting people to abandon polytheism and worship the true God, and then you can be environmentally conscious. But so then we have to look to the Sunnah, the Prophet, because he was taught how to embody the values properly. What environmental ethics emerge from observing the Prophet, peace be upon him?
Mm. Yeah, and with the the hadith narration we have, there are some that really strike you, that makes you that would make you think and take pause and to ponder on the changes that the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam was trying to bring about. So, for example, the famous hadith of that Eve, if there's a seed in your hand and Judgment Day, was coming upon you, still plant it. So even though this idea that everything's about to end, um, but planting of that seed still has value, that intrinsic value. It speaks volumes to what the Prophet was trying to do, trying to convey to the Muslim Ummah. And this preservation of water, right, and the right of that individuals are something that you know they're entitled to. There are some um, jurisprudence. There are some chapters that mention that to ask for water, have water, is a request that others should seek to fulfill, um, even to the extent where we really charge for that service. So being able to again engage within the earth in a effective manner, and again don't kind of uh, let us not forget that with each of these actions, there's also the dhikr of Allah that's being mentioned. There's also the name of Allah that we're taking. After we have food, after we have a glass of water, there are all these remembrances of God that we have within our religion. And unfortunately, it may be such that we've come to a point where these are just, you know, like supplications that we're mentioning without really thinking about the deep uh, nature behind them. Uh, why would God ask us to thank Him after having water? Um, why does the Prophet ﷺ use baths and as an example of how Salah purifies you? Um, these are all questions that are there, and again to really strike us into an awareness of what's around us and what's happening.
I think there's also a hadith about the Prophet mentioning about water. Do not waste, even if you're a river, do not waste the water if you're doing wudu.
Yeah.
And there's major water issues happening in the world, and it's actually a very scarce resource now that we're looking at it. Ground fresh water.
Yeah.
Lots of countries have major shortages of it, and I think there's also one about treatment of animals, which is I think there was a person who was he loaded the camel up too much, and the camel was under stress, and the Prophet recognized that the camel was carrying too heavy a burden, and he reprimanded that person for loading it too heavily.
Yeah. even with these narrations that are mentioned, and with the messages that are behind them, the idea to try and again reorient ourselves around the remembrance of God through His signs, which again is reference to water, to food, to nature, to uh, allow us to remember our place, is something which was emphasized by the Prophet ﷺ, quite repeatedly. I think that the other aspect as well to think about, how God and the Prophet through different hadith narrations, many a time uses nature as a uh, positive kind of akhirah, right? That's especially many times in the Quran, for example, again about, we'll have waters, milk and honey, and rivers of water, milk and trees, and then there's narrations about taking one bite from one apple in the hereafter, it'll be 70 bites, 70 tastes. These are all points of positive reinforcement, where nature is being used in a metaphysical capacity to try and allow us to conceptualize and understand not just our sustenance, but also that there's these aspects are much positive force within the world, as will be post the world that we live in.
Yeah, because even today, having fresh fruit and vegetables is far better than processed chocolates and things like that.
Yeah.
Like the health benefits, like I know apples full of sugar, but for some reason it's much better and much healthier than having a bar of Snickers, which is also a lot of sugar. So there's barakah, there's real benefit in eating what's fresh, what's God has made.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail exactly. Barakah is there within all these things, and that is how we have our intrinsic value within all these various different aspects.
And moving on now, how do we implement actually, I could say this actually before. Part of the reason why I'd say there's not much explicit, or there's not many explicit things about the environment in the Quran or the Hadith, right, is because they didn't have an environmental crisis going on. Resources were actually quite abundant in their time, right? So we've got such a large population now, a whole world to feed. Everything feels so scarce, land is scarce, and food is scarce, and so on. Um, how do we implement the ethics in the Quran and the Sunnah into our daily lives pertaining to the environment?
So I think again, with this point, um, personally, I think it's important to try and allow people to really contextualize the society that we're living in today in comparison to what the Arabs of the past were living in. So, as an example, if anyone has been to Umrah or to Mecca, Medina, the size of Masjid Nabawi would have been the entire city at the time of the Prophet, and even actually post for a number of years. That should really put into perspective what we're actually having to deal with today. I mean, if you can imagine, Medina at that time being a city, and at that time it was considered to be quite overcrowded and overpopulated. There were people there that would come for, the Jummah prayer, and there's narrations about people in the streets and things like that. If we were to really understand just the explosion of the human population on the earth, and the requirements and resources that we now need, it showcases to us that demand has increased so much. I think there was a study that was done, or there was a report that was done, I think, where in 1901 or 1905 there were roughly around 1 billion people on earth, and now at this current time, obviously we've gone past 7.
Yeah, it's exponential.
Exponential, right? So, and of course, with that, resources are also going to become, like you mentioned, needed and reduced. So, yeah, I mean, to so at the beginning when we mentioned about lobby groups and uh, kind of on MPs, I think the time now has come where Muslim organizations and individuals need to take a lead on this issue. Um, as an example, so within the paper that I've written, I have mentioned I think 5 things that we can do, which is kind of spread engagement, education within this, which alhamdulillah, this podcast kind of really helps and put in regards to environmental ethics because it still needs to be spoken about. Um, so you've got that educational aspect where our mosques, our masajid, our Islamic institutions, secondary schools, higher education, primary schools, really need to band together and to promote this in a way where it's just palatable for the students, but also engaging with parents and the wider community. I think second of all, onus on Muslim organizations look at how we can inculcate and incorporate kind of green alternatives to what it is that we're currently using. So as an example, the secondary school that I work at, a few years ago, we did manage to put in some solar panels into the building, and we've looked at how we can change our energy efficiency and become much more green in that sense.
Yeah, there's a masjid in Birmingham called, sorry to interrupt you. There's a masjid in Birmingham called Bahu Trust, and they've abandoned plastics now. And they have plastic-free iftars. It started with the Ramadan. They did plastic-free Ramadan was a campaign. So no plastic packaging, no plastic bottles and things like that. And they've gone full plastic-free now, which is quite good actually.
Yeah, so I think those initiatives are really important, and this podcast is actually serves to actually put those initiatives out there and to give individuals the idea that this can be done because much of the time you hear that phrase quite often being repeated, right? That, oh, how are we going to be able to do this? And it's not something that's possible. But in actual fact, there are ways to get around this. So another project, the next project now that we're looking at doing in our own Islamic school is to try and create roof garden spaces within the school that will help nature. It will help bring diversity of life, and it will allow action spaces as well for students and staff to kind of and be at. So that's the next project that we've got in the. We're hoping to have launched by the end of this academic year. So I think roof garden spaces, green spaces, engagement in education, uh, these activities themselves will bring about the press and media coverage and kind of out there. It's we're at a point now where talking about these issues isn't going to be enough anymore. It really has to now move to concrete action. And the longer this stays, the more danger that we're in of,
Yeah.
again, as we
And
just before, right, reaching that point where we can't really turn
and
back.
also political mobilization, because no matter how many plastic bottles we recycle, if we don't globally pushed, or not, even if we don't nationally push that our supply chains are made more environmentally friendly, like for instance, the government, we need to push the government to increase infrastructure or help subsidize paving the way towards electrification, whether that's battery investment and things like that. Because fundamentally, if lorries still run on petrol, if fertilizer is still made using natural gas, if cargo ships they still use kerosene, if we're flying all the time on airplanes, right? Plus, these small actions at home won't do much. Political mobilization is essential. And I think that one thing with the Muslim community in Britain is the sectarianism, which comes in the way
Yeah.
of banding together. How do we get across that?
Yeah, I think it's it's very difficult. Those who have a concern kind of figured for this, I think it's important that they reach out.
Mhm.
I think now where you have a new generation of young imams, young scholars, both male and female, um, brings new opportunities of uh, opportunities for collaborative partnership. And I think local organizations need to create environmental pressure groups and then get a buy-in from the local mosques, the local Muslim councils, the local community. If we're able to do, if we can get parents on board, mosques on board, councils on board, it's something which will speak across the community. And it is as you've alluded to and you've mentioned many times directly as well, this is an issue on the most kind of grandest of scales. And it's something which is going to take all of us to band together in to solve and to help. Without that, we aren't going to get where we need to be.
And one final question, because it's almost Maghrib time. We touched on population earlier. I want to know what you think about family planning and things like that, whether there's an Islamic a case to be made for it. Because as we can't, it's not sustainable to exponentially grow in population, because that puts further demand on resources, land and housing, all that kind of stuff. And traditionally Muslims have gone the opposite way and said, have as many kids as you want because God will provide, etc. And I get that, but what do you think about that argument?
I think it's something which is going to need cross discussion. I think it's something which groups. I don't know if you have heard of groups like the BBSI, the British Board of Islamic Scholars, and kind of the have where we've got scholars from both obviously male and female and across the various different communities within the UK that they're part of. I think this is something that they need to get together and have a discussion on, and then be able to publish something, whether it's guidance or advice that they can provide on this. There are these groups that have come about in the last few years, and they are beginning to publish things. So I think it's something that those groups need to take on board, and it's something that I'll definitely obviously pass on to individuals that I know within these groups, because again, it's not, it's going to take a group effort. If we're going to go, for example, for certain guidelines and guidance on family planning, you are going to need cross support across the community, different imams, scholars, mayors, and it's going to take that in order to be able to have an effort of that being able to be implemented.
Yeah, because I mean philosophically, someone telling someone else how many children they can have, that's slightly tyrannical. But do you think there's a case to be made for God rewarding people for not having children, so that the environment is the pressure on the environment is eased off for that sake? Do you think that's a rewardable act?
I think it's too because if I make that comment now, then it's almost how we have within our religion this idea of soteriology, right? About salvation theory and things like that. So it's going to get in a point of is that a definitive statement? Is it going to be able to change? Is it something that we definitely, as an ethical, we can say that there may be some reward or potential reward within this? Definitively, it's way too early for us to make that. So I think we need to roll with what can we, and remember that within this idea, right, of what is the morally right thing to do, is something which holds significant weight. So the scholars of the past, when they would describe certain actions, they'd mention that something is either is praiseworthy, or they'd mention something ugly. They wouldn't use the word haram, makruh, or this is forbidden. They'd use alternative words to describe it, and that was enough for people to take action. So I think if we can really emphasize the moral imperative of this, that will help embed this within the consciousness of Muslims across the UK.
Okay, thank you, Afsan. It's been pleasurable having this conversation.
Well, thank you. It's been being on here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.